Acts chapter 12. Now, if you remember last week in Acts chapter 11, where Dan finished up, there was this instance where the church in Antioch was beginning and it was flourishing. It was doing very well. And of course, we remember that phrase there in verse 26 of chapter 11. The disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. And then right after that, we get this note about a famine that is to take place during the time of Claudius. Claudius is Roman emperor of the time, and we're going to talk about him a little bit in just a second to kind of get our bearings and kind of timestamp everything that we're doing this morning. But a prophecy was given that there would be a famine during the time of Claudius. And so verse 29 of chapter 11, each of the disciples, according to his ability, and that's the disciples in Antioch, determined to send relief to the brothers who lived in Judea. This they did, sending it to the elders by means of Barnabas and Saul. And so we kind of end this chapter and we're seeing the church acting as it's supposed to. We have predominantly Gentile believers, sending relief to predominantly Jewish believers. And so the mission of the mixed Jewish-Gentile church is beginning on somewhat of a good note. Now, chapter 12 kind of represents kind of a parenthetical departure from this narrative, because it picks right back up again in chapter 13, right where it leaves off. But in chapter 12, we get this account of James being martyred. We get the account of Peter being taken and thrown into prison. And the implication is that he is also going to be executed. And then, of course, as the story progresses, we see him escape from prison due to the Lord's intervention. And then what happens to Herod at the end of this story. And so that's really what we're going to focus on tonight. Now, since we are focusing on Herod, I think we need to talk about which Herod this is. We see multiple Herods throughout the biblical narrative, right? And so when we think about Herod, we need to think of Herod less as an individual name and more as a title. It's a family title. And so the Herodian dynasty is a series of kings, princes, tetrarchs that are all known by this one name, the Herods. But each of them have their own name, they have their own legacy. Now, the thing about the Herods is, if you are a fan of soap operas, and I'm talking about the soap operas where everybody's just biting at everybody else and there's intrigue and deception and all this other stuff, this would make a killer, no pun intended, TV show. Because the Herods were a nasty, nasty bunch. Their family tree runs in knots. It collapses back in on itself a lot of times as they marry and intermarry and do all these types of things. But in order to get kind of a sense of the climate of what we're dealing with at this juncture in the book of Acts, I thought it would be nice or interesting, hopefully for you, to talk about Herod Agrippa and what has led up to this point. Now, the events that I'm going to cover are not covered in the biblical narrative. These are historical events covered by extraneous sources. But those sources jive along with the biblical narrative, and hopefully they'll give you some context as to what's happening, why it's happening, and where it goes from here. And I think by the end of this, hopefully, when we get to the end of this chapter and we see how this whole story plays out, that it will help us to see the point of the book of Acts and really where this book is going in terms of its larger scope and what Luke is trying to get us to see. So again, in thinking about Herod, the Herod we're dealing with is, I know that's kind of faded, I apologize for that, Herod Agrippa the First. Now, Herod Agrippa I was the grandson of Herod the Great. And if you recall, Herod the Great is the Herod that is in charge when Jesus is born. He is the Herod that orders the execution of all the innocents in the region of Bethlehem because of his jealousy and his suspicion. And that is the modus operandi for Herod the Great. He is suspicious to the core. He does not trust anyone he is crazy, yes he is, including his own children, some of whom he executes for that very reason. He has multiple wives, some of the wives he executes, and so Herod Agrippa is the grandson of that Herod. He is also the nephew, by extension, of Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas is the Herod that we see in Matthew 14, who beheads John the Baptist, and the Herod that we more primarily see in Luke 23, that Jesus is sent to. And so he's basically complicit in the death of Jesus alongside Pilate. And so, again, the Herod's a nasty bunch. Now, Herod Agrippa I grew up in Rome after Herod the Great, his grandfather, had Agrippa's father, Herod the Great's son, Aristobulus IV, executed via strangulation because he did not want him seeking the throne. He was afraid that he and his brother, Alexander, were going to seek after the throne. And so, actually, due to Aristobulus's half-brother, Herod Antipater II, who kind of stoked those flames in his father's suspicions, kind of pushed him in that direction. And so both of those young men, Aristobulus and Alexander, were executed via strangulation because Herod was suspicious of them and their possible conspiring for the throne. Incidentally, Antipater II also conspires against Herod the Great later on, but it doesn't really work out. Herod Agrippa, though, coming back to our main character here, he was a childhood friend when he grew up in Rome. He was a childhood friend of the future Roman Emperor Claudius. That is the very same Claudius that we read about here in chapter 11, verse 28. During the time of Claudius, there would be a famine. Okay, so this Herod is chummy with the Roman emperor of the day. That's going to come into play here in just a minute. Herod and his buddies, as they were running around together in downtown Rome, they had a reputation. They had reputations as playboys, and Herod in particular, his extravagant ways and his wasteful spending ended up racking up debt with Roman creditors. And so he was prodigally living the life of a young prince in Rome, and eventually had to flee the city because Emperor Tiberius was not having it. And so Agrippa flees to Idumea, if that sounds familiar. That is the modern in this time, name for the region of Edom. The Herods are Idumeans. They are half-breeds. And in particular, Herod Agrippa has both Edomite and Israelite blood running through him because his grandmother was Jewish. So Herod Agrippa, because of all this debt that he racks up and all the creditors seeking him, he flees to Idumea and he receives a stipend from his uncle, the formerly mentioned Herod Antipas. So his uncle is taking care of him while he is in quote unquote exile. However, he later gets on Antipas' nerves and then eventually returns to Rome, but then runs afoul of Tiberius and is put in prison. So he's just cooling his jets there in prison until Emperor Tiberius dies. And when Tiberius dies, his successor, Caligula, the next emperor, releases Agrippa and gives him the territories of Agrippa's uncles, Philip and Lysanias. I'm really going to have to work hard here because this is so hard to see. Okay, so this is the Mediterranean Sea right here. This is Jerusalem right here. So if you can see any of that. And so basically what he is given is this northernmost set of territories here that were up to this point maintained by his uncles, Philip and Lysanias, also children of Herod the Great. And really, we actually see those uncles and their territories in Luke chapter 3 and verse 1. They are mentioned there. And so those same territories that are mentioned here in the north of Judea are the ones that Caligula gives to Herod Agrippa the first. When Antipas is banished, Antipas also was over some of these territories. And so Antipas is eventually banished by the emperor, mainly due to Agrippa's schemes. Agrippa is also given administration of Galilee and Perea. So he has this, and he's given this here and this here. So his influence in this area is growing. And then when the emperor Caligula dies, his buddy Claudius ascends to the throne in Rome and gives him Judea and Samaria, which completes his control over the total territory ruled by his grandfather Herod the Great. So he is given the title of king. That is why we see him as King Herod. And he is basically in control of all of this at the time of Claudius ascending to the throne. Okay, now a little bit more about, this formatting is bad too. A little bit more about Herod Agrippa himself. Agrippa the First was very politically savvy. That's what he's known for. And so what he does is he suits his behavior to whichever group, Roman, Jewish, whatever, that he's trying to impress to gain status. And he's just constantly gaining status by flipping his demeanor and his attitude to whichever group it most pleases. Now, here's where he's particularly savvy in this area. Knowing that the Jews have no love for his family, the Herods, because they have been historically mistreated by the Herods. Herod Agrippa knows this, but he knows that in order to maintain peace in this area and to keep growing that power base, he has to please the Jews. And so he's pretty genius about this. Keep in mind, again, he is part Jewish. He has Jewish blood in his veins. However, he publicly observes Jewish holy days. He seeks every opportunity to win Jewish affection. And it's written about him in the Mishnah, in the Jewish writings. King Agrippa, this is a particular instance where Agrippa was there in front of the Jewish people. It says, King Agrippa stood up, he accepted the scroll to be read, and read while standing, and the sages praised him. So he stood to read the law. Why? Because that's what the king was supposed to do according to the law in Deuteronomy, right? And so he is pleasing the Jews by standing, a sign of respect, to read the law. When he reached the verse in the law, because you're going to run across this verse, you may not install a foreigner as king over you. Uh-oh, that's a problem. Well, what does Agrippa do? His eyes flowed with tears. Oh, I'm so sorry that I'm the leader that you've got. I'm so sorry that I'm not fully Jewish. Oh, but here's the Jewish attitude, though. They said to him, "Do not fear, Agrippa. You are our brother. You are our brother. You are our brother." And so he had so ingratiated himself to the Jewish people of this day that they were willing to accept him both as a Herod and as a foreigner as their king and say, all is forgiven. You are our brother. Do not even worry about that part of the law. Other things he did. He convinced Emperor Caligula not to install a statue of himself as God Emperor in the temple at Jerusalem. Had somebody else made that mistake previously? Yeah, they had. Yeah. Back in the period of silence, you had the Mad King basically install a statue of Zeus in the temple, sacrifice a pig on it, do all those types of things. And that eventually led to the overthrow of that dynasty within Judea, and then the installation of the Hasmonean dynasty of the Jews. He petitions Emperor Claudius on behalf of civil rights for Jews in Alexandria when anti-Jewish riots broke out there after the death of Caligula. When Caligula dies, the Greeks down in Alexandria, that's the Alexandria that's in Egypt, where the Library of Alexandria and all that is, basically, they rioted against the Greek-speaking Jews. They did not want any part with them, and so they started to oppress the Jews in that time. Well, seeing an opportunity, Herod Agrippa entreats his buddy and says, hey, if you will take it easy on them, it will go well for all of us. And so he's able to do that. He moved the seat of government from Caesarea, and that's Caesarea Maritime, to Jerusalem, which established Jerusalem as the political capital. And you could definitely see how that would be very favorable in the Jewish eyes. As they're under the thumb of Rome, they want a footprint in this kingdom, in their kingdom. And they had, up to the time of Augustus, essentially, had that capital city there in Jerusalem. But then Rome came in and said, no, we're taking that away from you. And they established the capital of that day in Caesarea Maritime on the Mediterranean shore. So Herod Agrippa says, hey, I got a way to curry favor. I'm going to move the capital back to Jerusalem. Now, I will say, while still maintaining a foothold in Caesarea, he has a summer palace in Caesarea that he goes to from time to time, and we'll see that in our narrative tonight, because it was a much more Roman-centric city, and he was able to maintain his political and social ties to Rome by going back and forth between the cities. Okay? One other thing he does, he begins rebuilding Jerusalem's wall and the fortifications, bolstering the city's security and prestige. So all these things that Agrippa is doing to curry favor with the Jews, all the while not really even caring about their welfare. He puts on a face in front of them and says, oh, my brothers, I am here for you. I am looking out for you. I'm doing all these things for you. And all of it is so that he can maintain power. That's his only motivation. Now, here is the major thing and where our text is going to pick up. Because Agrippa gained and held power by appeasing the masses, the Jewish masses, he was very interested in preserving the status quo via the Pax Romana. If you remember, the Pax Romana was basically the series of laws that had been instituted by Rome that basically maintained peace at the edge of a sword. As long as you're not causing trouble, we will leave you alone. If you start to cause trouble, or you start, we get whispers of you whispering against Rome or something like that, we're going to come in and quash that. It was good in some respects because it did allow travel on the roads of that day. It actually probably helped spread the gospel because of that. However, you were definitely under the thumb of Rome. You had no choice. And so Agrippa uses the Pax Romana, the peace at the point of a sword, and anything that threatened to disrupt the status quo among his constituency was quickly suppressed. Now, what at this point in Acts is disrupting the status quo among the Jews? It is the gospel. It is these pesky Christians. Okay? So Agrippa views Christianity as divisive and felt that their activity was a threat that could stir up antagonism in the Jewish population. It's the very thing that Pilate was worried about. Okay? And so he says, we're not having that. We're not doing that. Okay? So I'm going to do something about these Christians. That's where we're going to pick up in Acts chapter 12 tonight. Okay? So let's look at Acts chapter 12. Let's go through the first 5 verses, please. About that time, King Herod cruelly attacked some who belonged to the church, and he killed James, John's brother, with the sword. When he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter too during the days of unleavened bread. After the arrest, he put him in prison and assigned 4 squads of 4 soldiers each to guard him, intending to bring him out to the people after the Passover. So Peter was kept in prison, but prayer was being made earnestly to God for him by the church. All right, so with all of those things in mind about Herod Agrippa, that he's trying to maintain the status quo, that is going to squash any opposition to that status quo or anything that's going to rock the boat, we get this phrase. About that time, King Herod stretched forth his hand to mistreat some who belongs to the church. And it says he had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. Okay, now we have already had a martyr in the church. We talked about him on Sunday. We've talked about him in our recent classes, and that is Stephen in Acts chapter 7. And he is stoned to death by the religious leaders of that day. This, however, marks the first instance in this book so far of the powers that be in terms of kings and emperors now trying to quell this. So while the influence of Christianity is growing, so also is the attention amongst the different levels of government. That's what we're seeing. This thing is escalating. So in a sense, it's successful. However, it is going to have its casualties as well. And so the first casualty that we see here in this regard is James, the brother of John. That is James, the son of Zebedee, one of Jesus' closest friends. Now, I don't know if Herod knew that James was a close associate of Jesus. He probably did. He has a lot of family connections. He's a very smart and savvy man. Very cunning man, so surely he has done his homework, and that's why he starts with James. He gets one of Jesus' quote-unquote inner circle and one of the apostles, one of the leaders in the Jerusalem church, and has him put to death. Okay, and the implication of this is obvious. He is trying to intimidate the Christians of this area. Okay, so most likely Agrippa hoped to score big points with the Jewish leaders by eliminating one of the leaders of the Christian movement. If he can get rid of the biggest mouthpieces for Christianity, then he will just ingratiate himself to the Jews even more. Now, why do I say that? Well, because of verses 3 and 4 here. Based on verse 4, it appears that that supposition was correct. Killing James made him a lot more popular with the Jews. So he decides to double down on that by arresting Peter with the intent to let the Jews put him on trial. Now, I think that there's something interesting about this right here. How was James killed according to the text? At the point of a sword, right? Which most likely means what? He was beheaded, right? He was beheaded. Is that how the Jews killed people? No, they kill by stoning. That's the punishment. We saw that in Stephen's case. And so Herod has taken it upon himself to take John and do a swift Roman-style execution of James. Now, what do we read about what he's trying to do here with Peter? When he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter too during the days of unleavened bread. So what major Jewish holy day are we around right now? The Passover, okay? Yeah. Interesting though. See if you key in on some things here, by the way. He took him during the days of unleavened bread, and again, this is around the time of the Passover. After the arrest, he put him in prison and assigns all of these guards to be around him. Why doesn't he execute Peter the same way that he executed James? Swiftly, quickly, get it done with. Why does he wait? He wants to make a big show of it. Yeah, Agrippa is a showman. All right, and so he's going to do it in a way that gets the most attention and gets him the most praise for it. Now, what I find interesting about this is it says that he wants to put Peter on trial. Now, most likely, who would be doing the trial and what for? Why would Peter be on trial? Why was Stephen on trial? For blasphemy, right? I mean, here's Peter proclaiming that Jesus is the Messiah and all the same things that Stephen was saying, quoting all the same scriptures, all the same prophets, and in full agreement with Stephen. And so the idea here is he is probably going to be tried for blasphemy. Now, this is speculation, pure speculation on my part, okay? But it really fits with the type of ruler that Herod is. Why do you think that he was waiting until after Passover for this to take place? So that once the trial happens, then what?
I think it may have been similar to why the council would not go into Pilate. They were, going to be ceremonial clean for the Passover.
Yeah.
I suspect he wants to be ceremonially clean for the Passover.
Yeah.
And so we'll take care of this after that's done.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's even possible, again, speculation on my part, that he wants them to do it. That he's going to give Peter over to them and just let them get whipped up into a frenzy, and they will take care of this threat on their own, and they will be thankful to him for allowing them to do it. I don't know. But either way, he wants to make this big spectacle. So instead of executing Peter right out, he holds Peter until the Passover can be finished. So we pick up in verse 6 then. Yes.
Chance the reason he didn't kill Peter right away was because of the constant prayers that were offered by the church in verse 5.
So it's possible you could have God's intervention there. That's a very good question. Is it possible that the reason that there was a delay here is because of the prayers that are being offered? I hadn't considered that, but it is very possible. I would definitely consider that. Yes.
The thing that strikes me about verse 2, which kind of, I say, is a preface to my point, there's so little information that Luke chooses to give us about the execution of James. Potentially, this was actually a big show with James also.
Right. Yep.
Even though we have just a very brief discussion of it, the fact that Luke tells us that it pleased the Jews, it may have been something where Herod made a big show of the whole thing. He may have had a sham trial.
Yep.
He may have gone through this whole thing about arresting him and bringing him before the Jews, saw how well that went, and let's just do it again.
True. Yeah, there's a lot of details that we don't have, and again, historically, the historians don't cover this event in depth or anything, so we can only speculate about these things. But we do know that he is currying favor, and that's why. But there's a delay, and Ted makes a good point that this really could be part of God's intervention. That there is this delay. That's a very good thought on that. But verse 6 now. On the night before Herod was to bring him out for execution, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, while the sentries in front of the door guarded the prison. Now, I know Peter has got some fire in him. When he gets a hold of a sword, he can do some damage, apparently. This is a lot of guards for one guy. Why do you think there were so many guards on Peter?
They escaped before.
Yeah, I mean, they're no stranger to escape from prison, right? Acts chapter 5. I mean, he and the apostles were in prison, and the next thing the leadership knew, there they were back in the temple, just carrying on the same way that they did. Yes. Yeah, so he could be worried about people storming the prison, and then potentially that's also a possibility. Yes.
5,000 men.
Yes.
So, there's a significant number.
Yeah. So he's not taking any chances here. So verse 7 then, here we go. Here's the main event. Suddenly, an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. Striking Peter on the side, he woke him up and said, "Quick, get up." And then the chains fell off his wrists. "Get dressed," the angel told him, "and put on your sandals." And he did so. "Wrap your cloak around you," he told him, "and follow me." So he went out and followed, and he did not know that what took place through the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. And after they passed the first and second guard posts, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened to them by itself. They went outside and passed one street, and immediately the angel left him. So you kind of get this image of Peter having been walked through all of these things. Now, Peter probably has to go through, he's in the cell, he's probably got to go through multiple guard posts if they're just kind of walking through this structure, whatever it is. And then it says the big iron gate just opens on its own and Peter finds himself outside. And apparently this is the moment that Peter comes to. I don't know if it's particularly cold outside or something and Peter just wakes up, but he has this moment where he realizes, oh, this is a real thing that's happening. I am outside. Okay? So Passover has ended. Herod is ready to present the big prize. When Peter is in that cell, how do you think he's sleeping? I mean, how could he possibly sleep knowing what's potentially coming and what's already taken place? Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whatever his purpose is. I wanted to comment back, and this is just me kind of in my way of thinking.
Yeah.
Whenever you get into the Gospel of John,
Uh-huh.
and there's that discussion there where Peter's like, wait, you're seeing he's not, and God, and Jesus tells him, what's that to you?
Yeah.
You follow me. I always kind of infer that there's something there that Jesus got something in particular for Peter. You've got mission, plural, or whatever. You've got a purpose for Peter.
Yeah.
That he's probably not going to be the first one to go or among the first ones to go. There's something that he's got. That's just my speculation.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of have with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, to your point, I think he probably is, as he's sitting there, thinking back to that conversation from John 21, where Jesus does tell him, look, people are going to take you where you don't want to go. There's going to be a time when things are going to be happening to you that are not ideal, and you need to be ready for that. But you need to focus on what you need to focus on. So I'm sure he was probably thinking of that particular conversation. Who knows? Peter's probably exhausted. I mean, he's probably been through a whole lot, and so who knows? He may have been subject to beating already or any of those things. So he does find himself asleep in that cell, and so then the angel of the Lord appears. Peter is miraculously released from his bonds and escorted outside past guard posts and locked gates, as we just mentioned. And Peter believed it was a vision at first, but once he came outside, realized it was actually happening. And we already kind of talked about this before, but again, this is not Peter's first prison break experience. Acts chapter 5, we have that account. Yes.
I think Paul gives us a clue in a letter that comes later in the book of Philippians, where he talks about a peace that passes all comprehension.
Yes.
It really doesn't make sense. How could he be sleeping knowing tomorrow I'm going to be executed?
Right.
Like my close friend.
Yeah.
But this is the peace that comes from God.
Yep. Yep. In more ways than one.
Peace of the unleavened bread, where that's a reminder of God's delivering his people.
Yes.
I don't know if
that's a good point. That's a good
what
point.
A great moment for it to happen for Peter. That is on.
Yeah, that's a very good point, that this is happening during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, associated with the Passover, which was also associated with the Great Deliverance. So that's a very good point. Hadn't thought about that either. But interestingly, in chapter 5, Peter and the apostles did what? Where did they go? They went right back to the temple and started preaching again. Where does Peter go this time? He doesn't go to the temple. He doesn't go to a public place. He goes and he finds these people that he knows. He finds the Christians that are there meeting in the house of, according to verse 12, meeting in the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark. Okay? So Peter finds himself in the city. He finds his way to the house of Mary. How does he know how to get there? Why does he go there? Okay. Why do you think Peter goes to this house with these people instead of immediately fleeing the city for his life? What do you think? Speculate with me. Okay, so he could be going there to warn them. All right. Anything else?
I think in Acts, what is it, Acts 5, where they're meeting the second time they brought before the council, and they immediately go to the brethren, report everything that happened, and everyone rejoices and encouraged and stimulated. I think Peter may be doing the same thing here.
Yeah. So he could be warning them. They are already very well aware of Herod's intentions. They know what happened to James. They know that Peter was in jail. They were praying for him because of that. But also, Peter, I think, probably goes back, first of all, because this is probably the main point of contact for him in the city. He knows these people and they know him, as evidenced by the fact that Rhoda knows his voice when he comes to the door. Without ever even seeing him, she knows his voice. So he is familiar with this group of Christians in the city. But I think also, to Eddie's point, he is probably telling them this story of deliverance so that they know and so that they can tell others as well. And so there is an encouraging aspect to this, this visit to the house of Mary as well. Okay? So Peter has probably been working with these people and had contact with them throughout his ministry in Jerusalem. That's why he expects to find people there in the middle of the night. He knows they're there praying for him because they were probably praying for James. And they were probably praying in the aftermath of what happened to James. So he knows where the people are. He knows they're going to be up all night praying. Now, how about that? We did kind of skip over the verse that Ted mentioned there, verse 5. Prayer was being made earnestly to God for him by the church. So you think about this. In the face of an overwhelming threat, what is the posture of the Christians here? What is the posture of the assembled church? It is not insurrection. It is not uprising. It is to come together in constant, fervent, earnest prayer. Okay? And this has been the way that believers have been throughout Acts so far. We see them over and over again in places, both together and individually, constantly praying, constantly seeking the Lord's guidance, and constantly thanking Him. So, thought question based on this. We may run out of time, but I'm fine with it on this question. What is our position as a group of believers here at Fayette? What is our position on prayer as a group of believers and how we think about that? In times of distress, which we don't experience a ton of distress here in the United States, but there are times when things affect us, right? Or affect our spirit. In times of distress, is it worthwhile for us to gather specifically to pray? And I'll put that out there. I hear everybody saying yes. I don't hear a single no in the audience. And that's a good sign. Now, here's my question. And I'm putting this out there for me as much as everybody else. When we say we're going to have a specific time that we're going to meet together to pray, what is your thought process on that in that moment, at that time? Is it always, I can't wait to get together with my brothers and sisters to pray about XYZ? Or is it, man, I hope that that's not at this time because I really wanted to do this other thing? Or it's just a prayer service. If I'm not there, nobody's going to miss me, you know. How do we think about prayer together as an assembly and the effect that that has, both in times of distress or maybe it's times of joy and growth? Maybe there's nothing specifically pressing on us at the moment, but there are things that we want to give thanks for, that we want to rejoice about together. Is it worthwhile for us to gather specifically to offer thanks? Of course it is. Why don't we when the opportunity is presented to us? And again, I'm offering that question to each of us to think about inwardly. Why would we not want to get together to pray together as a group about these things? Okay, so very quickly, Peter goes to the house of Mary, mother of John Mark. We have that humorous account of Peter banging on the door, and Rhoda just leaves him there. And she goes and tells the people, and they tell her she's mad. And she goes, "I'm not mad. I just left Peter at the door. He's still knocking outside. I can tell you, he's right there." That doesn't say that, but that's the implication there. They call her mad, but then of course they see Peter, they interact with Peter, and they realize that this thing has actually taken place. And Peter says, "Report these things to James and the brothers." Now you might have a record scratch there in your mind. This is not the James that has just been killed. This is another James. It's also probably not James the son of Alphaeus. It is most likely James the brother of Jesus. And the reason I say that is because we see him in various places associated specifically with the church in Jerusalem. We're going to see him in Acts chapter 15. We're going to see him again in Acts chapter 21. Paul writes about him in Galatians chapter 1. And in all those instances, he is among the brethren in Jerusalem working there. And so basically we just get this kind of throwaway statement right there at the end. Then Peter departed. That's it. And that's, for the most part, the last that we see of Peter in the Acts narrative. He will show up again in Acts chapter 15 with the Jerusalem Council, but he is not the predominant figure in that particular account. So we have followed these men. We followed Peter, we followed Stephen, we followed Philip, we followed Barnabas, all of these individuals, and the narrative shifts right here. And we're going to, in the beginning of chapter 13, really start focusing primarily on Paul himself. Okay? Next time we'll talk a little bit about just what happens to Herod very quickly as a springboard, and then we will use that to drive us into chapter 13. Thank you all for your comments tonight.